going to talk a little bit about taxonomy. Now, I'm not sure if the textbook actually uses the word phylogeny, but that's what we're going to talk about here. So a phylogeny is kind of like a family tree, but on a much larger scale. A phylogeny is a diagram that shows the relatedness between organisms, and usually it's showing species groups or larger groups. So in the textbook, we see a phylogeny of the tree of life. It doesn't include all species, but it includes some major groups above the species level. Now, one of the things that it has on that diagram at the base is LUCA, or LUCA. This stands for the last universal common ancestor. And so this was something that was closely related to the first cell on Earth, the very ancient lineage. That LUCA organism had a lineage. Of course, again, we're not talking about just a single cell, we're talking about a population of single-celled organisms. And that population eventually split into two, and actually it also split here. And so these are the three major branches that we've been talking about so far in class. And the bacteria are here. And then this branch, which is shared, is for the archaea and the eukaryotes. So a little bit more about phylogeny. Again, it's very similar to a family tree diagram. Because this branch is alone, it means that it's more distantly related to these two groups than they are to one another. So archaea and eukaryotes, they are more closely related to one another. If you travel down this line from eukaryotes, you see you first come to the intersection with archaea. And so that means that that is a closer relative than what you find at the next junction, which is bacteria. Now, bacteria is a very diverse group, and it is actually the most diverse group of organisms that we know of. And when I say the most diverse group of organisms, you could define that or interpret that in a couple of different ways, but for our purposes, bacteria have the most species, or the most speciose, or they have the highest number of species on Earth. And species are very divergent. And you saw this in the reading, which details how bacteria can inhabit almost every single environment on Earth. So from dust particles, where you might find the radiodurans, which is actually an archaea, so I guess that's a bad example, but from inside of your body, you would have things like Enterobacter and maybe Actinobacter, to in the soil, where you might find some Bacillus, to the water, where you might find some cyanobacteria. All of these different species are part of bacteria. So these groups that I've drawn up here, these are domains. And this is the domain system, where we have these three domains. And then you could split these domains up into smaller, more specific groups. So for example, in eukaryotes, you could split this up into fungi, plants, and animals. And there are more groups than that as well. Similarly, we could split up archaea and bacteria into smaller, more specific groups, which fall under this main category. So that's what they're talking about in terms of the taxonomy, and the relatedness is called phylogeny. So taxonomy are the names, and the phylogeny is the positioning of the relationships of these organisms. So again, this is a phylogeny here, and then taxonomy is the naming of different species and organisms. Different species and different levels, so like class, phylum, etc. Okay, so something else that I wanted to mention is that in the bacterial lineage, it gets a little bit confusing. So bacteria are a really diverse group, as we've said, and there's no, you can't say, okay, we had a split from bacteria, and we have all gram negatives here and all gram positives here. There are groups that have mostly gram negative or mostly gram positive, but you don't have any one group that has every single gram negative in it or every single gram positive in it until you say bacteria, which is a much broader group.